Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and you're watching SQL Server, SQL Server 2008. In this video, we're looking at performance. So what are the topics? Here's our overview. SQL Profiler / SQL Trace, which is kind of a T-SQL version with a graphical interface version. We'll be talking about that. We'll be looking at and showing how Windows System Monitor fits in with the SQL Server monitoring and performance. We'll talk about Activity Monitor, what it has to offer when you'll use it. Transact SQL or T-SQL. Now that's a huge one. We'll touch upon a few different stored procedures and things of that nature and talk a little bit about why and when you would use T-SQL for your performance monitoring. We'll spend some time looking at the Windows logs and show how SQL Server uses Windows logs to store the results of activities within SQL Server. Default trace, we'll mention that. Dynamic management views, we'll play around with those and use those. But starting with the SQL Profiler, and I have their / SQL Trace. SQL Profiler, the relationship there gives a graphical user interface to the same types of results that SQL Trace can produce with T-SQL. SQL Profiler is going to show how SQL Server actually resolves the queries internally. What are the steps that it's taking? It allows your administrator to see the transact SQL statements and what it's doing to actually bring back the result sets. That way you can determine if it's doing things that are unnecessarily resource intensive. So you can do things such as create a trace. You create these traces based upon templates. Now SQL Server comes with reusable templates that have certain things that it wants to look for and record in the trace file. And I shouldn't say file because you can save it in a file or a database. Or you can go in and create your own trace completely from scratch, including whatever metrics that you want to have saved in your output. You can actually watch the trace results as they're being generated, so you can see what statements are executing while it's actually happening. Now, as far as what to do with all that information, and it will be rather voluminous. You'll have a lot of information typically from a trace. And you can save that in a file or in a table, depending on what you want to do with it. If you want to be able to run queries against it, looking for specific types of actions, having it in a table is going to be the best choice. And then you can also replay your trace results. So if I want to see this process again, there's actually a replay option with the SQL Profiler. So when will I use SQL Profiler and SQL Trace? It's going to be very helpful for doing things such as trend analysis. So for example, go in, create a baseline trace. Where's my server at today? We're happy with the way it's performing. But then over time, as new applications are introduced against your server or existing applications are modified, you can then continue to monitor using SQL Profiler and see what's changing. Once again, I can replay captured events, which is a great benefit. Ad hoc monitoring, right? Something's going on with your server and you want to get a quick peek at that current state of affairs. You can sit down with SQL Profiler, run a trace, and see what's going on. The interface, once again, is graphical. For some people, that's really cool. For some people, that's like, get that mouse out of here, give me a keyboard. But it does have a graphical interface. And you can use it with custom applications. So let's say you want to create your own application that takes the results of the SQL Profiler and does analysis on it, or does filtering on it, or does anything that you deem necessary. You can create your own application to read and manipulate and utilize that information. But here, let's move over to the SQL Server box and actually bring up SQL Profiler and see some results. So let's go to the Start menu and go into All Programs, SQL Server 2008, go into Performance Tools, and there's my SQL Server Profiler. Now what I'm going to do with this is, well, here, go to the icon, and we're going to create some information, or we're going to save some information for the activity happening in our server. So go into the New Trace button, or you go to File, either way, go to New Trace. It prompts me to log into a server, and I'm only working with my local server right now. So I'll go ahead and click Connect. And here's where I start to set some of the trace properties. First of all, a name, and I'll just call it Veronica Trace. There's more in this database. I'll say local trace, because it's actually for the server, the database as a whole, as opposed to any particular database. Now, what information do I want to track? You have various templates that give you information you can track. SP counts, there's my standard, various things with T-SQL, duration, groups, locks, if you want to T-SQL replay, so a lot of different things you can track. But I'm going to go with a standard template. And we're going to save that to either a file or a table. I'm going to dump mine to a table because it then allows me to easily query against it and look for specific types of events and sort based on various characteristics of those events. So connect, it'll prompt me to get into that table, and I'm going to create a table called trace data. Click OK. I'm going to save that in the master. That's fine for now. I could save that in any database. I could have a separate database set up and save my trace data in that database. I'm just going to dump it in the master database for now. Click OK. I can set the maximum number of rows. Let's go put a nice, and that's in thousands by the way, so that's 100,000. It's not just 100 rows. And I can set a stop time for that, start time. If I move over to the events section, I can see what's in this standard default trace. It's giving me information on logins, so successful logins, logouts. Gives me the username, the actual SQL login name. Remember, those are different. The application that's running, if it's an application, and then how much CPU time is being taken up, reads, writes, duration, etc. Sessions, what are my connections like, and my stored procedures, what's going on with my remote procedure calls. T-SQL, what's going on with my batch completed, my batch starting, so what's being run against my server, and I want to know things such as key stuff. Duration, how long is it taking for a piece of SQL code to run? This will help me to start to identify my long running queries and be able to figure out why performance isn't where I want it to be. So scrolling back over, I'm going to click run. That'll start this. So my trace is running, but nothing's going on in my SQL Server database, so there's no data showing up yet. But I'm going to bring this down to the lower part of my screen, so hopefully we can see two things at once. Go Start. I'm going to bring up SQL Server Management Studio and click Connect. Bring that down a little bit, and notice there I've got a screen full of information already on the various activities that are happening in my server. Text data saying what exactly is happening, what's the SQL statement, what's the store procedure, there's a create table statement, right? Whatever's being run. So I'm creating some tables in my temp database here. What application is doing that? See, it's simply Microsoft Management Studio, which is what we'd expect. That's what we just started. The username, I logged in as MDM, so it's showing that, and then the login name, which is going to be domain name followed by username. And here, let's maximize that. There we go. CPU reads, writes, so all kinds of information, duration, how long did it take for it to run. And once again, that's going to be some of the key stuff we want to keep track of. Now, all this stuff is showing 0 time because all we did was log in. Shouldn't take SQL much of any time at all to do that. And that's what we should expect, okay? But let's go ahead and just start doing some stuff on the database. And I don't have a lot of data out here, but what I'm going to do, File, Open, I'm just going to destroy and recreate that Veronica database, since I have a script that can do that. And just the process of opening that up, notice the profiler's logging that. When I execute that, I'm getting a lot of stuff happening once again in my environment down here. Okay? And I'm saving all of that to my database, to a database. So now, after that process completes, I can stop the logging, stop the profiler. And if I go back to my Management Studio, go to Databases, System Databases, go to Master, go to Tables, and there's that trace data table that we just created with the information we just added. So if I right-click and just select, say, the first 1,000 rows from that, I can see I did indeed populate it with some information. Application names, usernames, login names, and most important right now is my duration column. There it is. So I can see how long the various things are taking to run. Now, a lot of things in here are showing null because based on the type of activity, it really doesn't record anything based on its event class. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to grab everything that's of an event class 12, and if you can look that up, but event class 12 simply means it's a batch SQL statement. So I can see things such as my sets and my if statements. So anything that was run, my select statements. Okay, so I'm going to only grab those. So here, let's open a new query window. I'm going to type select. I want to see the text data column, that is the descriptive information for what we saw on this for what we saw on the screen. Duration, I want to know how long it took for it to run. I want to know how much CPU time it took. And that's all from my trace data table. And we only want for the event class 12. So we're not wasting a lot of time looking at stuff that's not really part of the activity in the database. So using that, click execute. And now I can see who's taking up the time in the process. So here's a process that took 25,000 milliseconds. These are milliseconds, by the way. Very little CPU time. Scrolling on down the list, and I have access to, like this particular operation, the drop database. Took quite a bit more, about half a million milliseconds, 558 milliseconds. But using a combination of the trace tool and then various queries against that information, you can start to get a feel for what's going on in your database and how much time the various processes are taking up. And then that gives you a starting point for determining what you can do to optimize your SQL Server database and improve the performance. What are the applications, what are the queries, the requests that are causing those most problem, and what can I do to optimize those? If you've worked in Windows for any period of time, you've got some familiarity with this next tool, the Windows System Monitor. You may not know it by that name, but you've seen it before. It tracks resource usage across the board in Windows. It's not specific to SQL Server, but as a major player on the Windows platform, SQL Server is definitely well represented within Windows System Monitor. Now you may know it by other names such as Performance Monitor or as Reliability and Performance Monitor. It's referred to as a few different things in different environments. We're in currently for this course, I'm using the Windows 2008 platform. So it's going to be called actually Reliability and Performance Monitor, the application at least. And then inside of that, you'll see Performance Monitor as one of the options when we jump inside there. System Monitor collects counts and rates rather than data about events. So for example, you'll see things such as memory usage or number of active transactions, maybe the number of blocked locks or your CPU activity are some of the things you're going to typically see with System Monitor. You can also set thresholds on specific counters to generate alerts that will notify your operators. If you compare SQL Server Profiler with System Monitor, SQL Server Profiler monitors database engine events. This thing happened or that thing happened, versus System Monitor monitors resource usage. When do you use it? Three main things. Trend analysis, as before, so you can save and compare. You can also use it for a key thing here, and that is generating alerts. You want to know when your memory, available memory reaches a certain threshold, notify your operators. And it also has a graphical interface. But here, let's move over and look at it. So going to my Start menu, Administrative Tools, and Reliability and Performance Monitor, aka the Windows System Monitor, and continue to get into that. And there's the default interface. But if I go into Performance Monitor, I get a default screen or a default graph it's doing, but just delete that. I go to Add, and here I can pick which objects from the Windows environment that I want to track. And this isn't just SQL Server again, like there's my processor itself, or processor performance, several different Windows components. But I'm going to scroll down until I get to the SQL section. So there's the SQL agent and the various alerts, and I could expand that and look at specific items underneath that object, or just take the entire object. I'll scroll down a bit more and get to database. We'll pull that one. There's the CLR. Go database. It lists the different things available, which databases. So I could specifically pick, say, just the Veronica's database. I'll just grab all of them for now. Click Add, click OK, and my graph starts to populate. I can see the individual items here at the bottom and their scale that it's using. And there's not a lot of activity in this database. You won't get a lot of visual here. If I go to histogram, I can see the numbers there, but once again, those numbers are a bit skewed due to the lack of data or activity on my database right now. And then there's a report, probably the most helpful thing in here right now, because things such as data files is going to be pretty accurate, log file size, log files used, and replication type activity. But that's the kind of stuff you're going to have available to you in your system monitor, aka performance monitor, and allows you to customize. Now you want to be careful of the fact that the more you monitor, the more resources you are using. So I can easily do this from another remote server. I could start this and monitor my SQL Server from another box, but that's still going to impact the performance of my SQL Server box. Okay? So let's move back to the slides and continue on. When you load up the activity monitor, you'll have a very windowy looking graphical user interface. It's actually broken up into 5 sections. And then the first section, an overview section, is actually subdivided into 3 or 4 graphs, each one focusing on a different resource such as processor time or database I/O. The second section, the processes section, will show the users and their activities, which is really cool. So you can see what applications or individual users are doing things that are impacting your system and how much they're impacting your system. The third section, your resource weights, will show your wait state information. What process is waiting for what resource. Number 4, your data file I/O section will give you all your I/O transactions for your data and your log files. And then number 5, your recent most expensive queries. So you can find out what's the activity, what's the query that's actually costing you the most as far as system resources. If you look at when you would typically use Activity Monitor, 2 main things. If you want a graphical user interface, it's definitely got a very, very graphical user interface. And it's not going to give you much as far as trend analysis. You don't really save the information typically. But for ad hoc monitoring, for jumping in and getting a quick high-level overview of what's going on with your server, great tool for that. So here, let's jump over and look at it. So going to my Start menu, I'm going to bring up SQL Server Manager. Go ahead and log into my local server, and this icon here is for my Activity Monitor. Bringing that up, 5 main sections. The first section is just your overview section. Give me things such as processor time, 0% right now, pretty slow day on the processor, waiting tasks, database I/O, and batch requests. And then the other 4 sections, I can see what processes are out there. Basically shows me information for any active user connections. So I'm showing 2 logins here basically, which is still really just me. What they're actually doing currently, task state, commands that are being run. So similar to information we saw in the previous tool. Resource waits, anybody waiting for access to any resources. Right, I'll close that back down. Data file I/O section, so I can see who's writing, who's reading, and then any expensive queries that are run. So I'm showing one that has a slightly longer duration where I opened up a row set here. Okay, so that kind of information is available in a graphical user interface. And there, my data file I/O section just populated with some transactions to my master and my model and my temp, as well as something in my Veronica's database. So here, let's file, just kind of give it some more activity. So I'm going to rerun the script to create the database. And then I can see it in action over here. So I can see running happening against the temp DB. I can see once again the only activity, the only application rather, is my Management Studio, and it's running a query. And there's no waiting, no blocking going on, and that completed successfully. Now the difference, one of the differences here with this tool is it's a graphical interface, so jumping in there real time and seeing what's going on with your server. It's not something you're going to use to do historical information or trend analysis. So it's more ad hoc. We're doing ad hoc on the spot analysis of what's going on with your server. Okay, so moving on to the next tool. When we talk about using Transact SQL to monitor performance in SQL Server, that's really a huge topic. I mean, there's entire categories of Transact SQL statements out there that are used for monitoring SQL Server. So for example, you may have your database console command family, various functions out there, trace flags, tons of stored procedures. Even some of the visual tools, graphical tools we're using, are actually going to have T-SQL underneath the hood in many cases. But for right now, I want to focus on just 4 tools, 4 system stored procedures that you can run to get a quick bird's eye view and sometimes a detailed level view of what's going on with your SQL Server box. And they are the SP-Who, SP-Lock, SP-Space Used, and SP-Monitor. So starting with SP-Who, that's going to give you information about the current SQL Server users and the processes they're running, including the currently executing statements and whether or not the statement is actually blocked. So that can be really helpful. SP-Lock, on the other hand, is going to give you information about your locks, including what object is actually locked, the index ID of the object ID of the object, type of lock, and the type of resource to which the lock applies. So very helpful if you're having a lot of issues with locking. SP space used is going to display an estimate of the current amount of disk space used by a table, or if you need it, of the whole database. So you have that kind of flexibility. And then SP Monitor is going to display various types of statistics, including things such as your CPU usage, your I/O usage, and even the amount of time that was spent idle since the last time you ran SP Monitor. So it's a pretty handy tool to have. As far as when will you use Transact SQL, well, you'll use it a lot, but it's definitely ad hoc. When you need to sit down and get a quick picture, Transact SQL can be a great way to do it. And another cool thing about the Transact SQL, because it's basically code that you're running, you can create your own applications that take advantage of your Transact SQL statements. So let's jump over to the server and see them in action. Looking at Transact SQL, there's a few Transact store procedures that are out there that are worth looking at. Well, there's quite a few, but we're going to focus on 4 of them. So going back into my database again, bring up a query window. And the first one I'm going to look at is SP-Who. Actually, let's back up a second. SP_help, first of all, gives you some general information about the huge number of built-in stored procedures that are out there. Okay? So that's one thing that's at your disposal to see a lot of different things that are out there. There's a huge list of all those out there. But I'm going to back up, and I'm going to look at SP-Who first of all. Pressing F5 to run that. Gives me information on who's logged in, what processes they're running, and anything related to blocks is available via SP-Who. So these are things that you as a DBA, database administrator, you need to sit down and quickly find out what's going on, what's the status of your system. SP-Who is one of the 4 that you might typically use. SP-Lock is another one. Gives you a quick assessment of, as you may have guessed, the locks that are going on in your database. Not a whole lot of locks going on in mine right now, but that would quickly identify any of those that are outstanding. SP space used. Where I'm at on resource utilization. Currently my master database has a size of 4 3/4 megabytes. Unallocated space out there. So other helpful information, you can tell it specifically what databases you want to look at. And then last on the list of 4 is SP Monitor. Gives me a quick assessment of what's currently running, the last thing that ran, how long it took, what's going on with my CPU, what's going on with packet traffic, and what's going on with my read-write activity. So once again, these are ways to quickly sit down and start to assess what's the status of a server, of a SQL Server box. Alright? So moving back. Next, looking at Windows logs. This is another tool that if you've been around the Windows environment for any length of time, you're familiar with Event Viewer and Windows logs. If not, that's okay. But similar to System Monitor, it's not specific to SQL Server. It's actually more generic than that and will track information about all your applications in your Windows environment. SQL Server will write to the Windows logs, and typically in the application section, and you'll be able to find information about all your audits, who logged in when. Actually, here, I have this for you. So your SQL Server services, when they start, when they stop, any problems they have. If you've got any audits running, right, such as you're auditing logins, you're auditing failed logins, you're auditing successful logins, all that kind of information can be dumped in there. And then any errors that occur in SQL Server are also dumped into the Windows log. Now you can go in and then query that information, or I should say filter that information, to pull out just the stuff that you want to see, as opposed to having to look at all the errors that are in there, because it won't just be SQL Server information. So when do we use it? Two main things: ad hoc monitoring, and it also has a graphical user interface. So it'll be something you can use fairly easily, fairly quickly, by jumping into the graphical user interface. But here, let's jump over and look at the logs. And so our next option is the Windows logs, which you access through the Event Viewer. So once again, going to Start, Administrative Tools, going up to Event Viewer. I don't need to continue through that. But here, going to the Windows logs, SQL Server writes to the application log. Clicking on Application, right here at the top, you can see a series of recent SQL Server entries. So I could click on one of those and get more information about those here at the bottom, such as something here happening with file stream, or there's a configuration change we just made with the DMV earlier today. So I could say filter this, because I've got quite a few things in here from the various applications, and it's not all SQL Server related. But creating a filter, I could say filter by source, and then pick from the various sources. We want MS SQL right now. Let's go into SQL Server, click in there, fills it in, click OK, and give it a name. Click OK again. So I've created a server only filter, so I can see just the events specific to SQL Server. A lot easier. Looks like I got a great stable environment here, all informational, no errors, no warnings. Right? But once again, that's a Windows filtering, Windows monitoring type of tool. But as an application in the environment, you'll be able to track SQL Server in this environment as well. Moving on to the default trace, also known as the SQL Server black box. You know, like if your server crashes, the black box survives, and you can go and analyze what's in it and see what went wrong. That's kind of what default trace is. And as the name indicates, it is a default tracing mechanism that's always on by default unless you specifically turn it off. And there's a stored procedure sp_configure that you can run that will turn it off. So simply saying exec space sp_config space, and then in single quotes, default space trace space enabled single quote, comma, and then in single quotes the number 0. That'll turn off your default trace. But once again, by default it's on. It's one of those things, just leave it there. It's not going to take up a lot of resources, very efficient, and it automatically cycles through and reuses the same space. So it's not building a massive log file that you have to go out there and truncate at some point. So that's one of the options available. There's also a more robust version of it, so you can simply say same thing, exec space sp_config, and in the single quotes you want to put in there the show, what I have there, show space advanced space options, and using a 0 turns it on. Now going back to the previous one there, just by the way, if you have turned it off, to turn it back on, run the exact same command that I have there with a 1 instead of the 0. And same thing with the show advanced options. Turning it on, you want a 1. Turning it off, you want a 0. But here, let's go in and try that out. So I'll go to my Start menu and bring up my SQL Server Management Studio. It's the easiest way to run some SQL commands. Go to New Query, and I'm going to run the store procedure that can enable or disable exec sp_configure. And let's say I want to turn it on or off. Comma, and then putting a 0 for turning it off, or a 1 for turning it on. And then I'll need to run the reconfigure command to have that actually take effect. But pressing F5 on that, configuration option, default trace enabled. Mine was already on, so changing 1 to 1. So like I said, it's always on by default anyway. They actually have some advanced options you can turn on as well. So instead of just turning it on or off, I could say things such as show default options. And I believe I've already turned that on this one, but show advanced. There we go. So showing my advanced options to give more information in that file. Now, where is the file saved at? It's just a regular trace file, so the same tools we've been using before to view trace files will still apply. And it puts them in the default location where it stores most of the other stuff related to SQL. So I'll just minimize that and go into Start, My Computer, go into my C drive, go to SQL Server folder, go to SQL Server, and here I have a logs folder. Open that up. I have 5 trace files, and it actually creates these 5 files with a first in, first out type of a cycle happening. And I can open these using my same SQL Server profiler. It's just a SQL Server profiler file like before. Now, if I double click on one of these, now grab one that I haven't touched yet before. Failed to open file, access denied. You don't have rights to open that file up by default. By default, it's all locked down. But if I right click and go to properties, I can of course change that. Go continue. And Windows is like, oh yeah? I'm saying yes. I'm just going to add my account in there, my MDM account. Give him rights to read it. Click OK. And now if I double click that, my SQL Server profiler opens up, and I can actually see that file. And then it queries saying, okay, I've gotten to the end of this file. Do you want to skip on to the next file? If I do that, once again, I don't have read access in that file yet. It'll just die, so I'll just kill that. But you could actually use that to just skip through the files one at a time. But these are the files that it's writing to in turn automatically in the background. Once again, if you get to the point where you say, you know, I like the other tools better, I'm going to turn this off, you can do that, and you can save yourself a little bit of processing time, even though this is not real processing intensive. Okay? But that's your default trace. So moving on to our next tool, let's move back over. Now I want to talk to you about the dynamic management views. I don't know why, but I just kind of like these. I just like those built-in views that are available in SQL Server. If you go to your System Views folder, there's a ton of stuff in there, but if you scroll down far enough, you see a section where they all start with sys.dm underscore. Those are your dynamic management views, and they're basically a picture or a view to the underlying data that's being collected by SQL Server. And it's just like any other view that you may have created. It's not the actual table, but you reference it just like a table. So you have all the flexibility that you would have with working with information in a table. Now, why do we go through a view versus the direct source of that information? For a lot of the same reasons you typically go through a view. You don't want the users to have direct access. There may be a column you don't want them to see, or you might want to filter the information. And then another really big benefit is the interface can be made stable while the underlying structure can change. So let's say the tables that this information is actually coming from, Microsoft decides they want to completely restructure that. They can do that because you're not referencing the tables directly. You're only referencing the views. And then the views can be rewritten by Microsoft or whoever is rewriting the tables so that they can correctly access the data in the tables. But here, let's jump over and look at our dynamic management views. Here in my SQL box, bring up my Management Studio and expanding my databases folder, going to Veronica's. If I hit my views, there's my system views, expanding that, there's a whole suite of system views. The dynamic management views are going to be the ones that start with sys.dm. And as I said before, there's a huge list of these. You're scrolling down, let's grab some of them on, say, database transactions. If I right click on that and just grab some information out of that, I can see what types of transactions are happening. You can see things such as locks, etc. Here, let's grab something. Microsoft has a nice entry in the books online that kind of categorizes these so you can have a feel for which views is going to be helpful for which issues. Let's go ahead and bring up my browser. Go to MSDN. dynamic management views and functions. And here's a list of the categories of those views. So you've got about 17 or so different categories with things such as your data change capture related information, query notifications, CLR, again your common language runtime, anything related to mirroring, so full text search, IO related, anything that's SQL operating system related, extended events, anything going on with service broker or resource governor is going to be available in one of your dynamic management views. So one more tool to put in your toolbox for determining what's going on in your environment. So jumping back, I wanted to put everything on one page for you, and I grabbed this chart directly from Microsoft on their performance website and Books Online, but it summarizes what tools you use when, and not everything is on here. Dynamic management views isn't on here, but like I said, it's really just a view into the data. But looking at what is on here, SQL Server Profiler is kind of like the Cadillac. It's going to give you the most bang for your buck. It's going to give you the most voluminous amount of information on SQL Server as well. But the only thing it doesn't do is generate alerts for you. But as you can see, you have Windows System Monitor. That'll do that. Windows System Monitor is great for trend analysis, just like SQL Server Profiler. And then it has graphical user interface, both of those do. Activity Monitor is your ad hoc tool. Something's not quite right. You want to pull up something where you can get a quick picture of what's going on. That's your Activity Monitor. Transact SQL, great for ad hoc monitoring. Great for building your own custom applications to monitor and track what's going on in your SQL Server. And then there's your log files. So when things aren't quite happening like they should, you can see what tools are the ones you might start hitting first. Maybe the log files, followed by Activity Monitor. SQL Server Profiler is going to give you so much information that it's not usually your first choice for ad hoc monitoring. And then those error logs do have a graphical user interface. So what did we cover? We talked about the tools, some of the tools at least, that you'll be using in SQL Server to monitor what's going on in that environment. You want to spend a little time, getting familiar with those tools, and then as you get your footing under you, you might want to spend some time looking at the Books Online and other tools that Microsoft has and other examples how to use some of these tools. As far as new terms, the only new terms were actually the tools themselves. We talked about the SQL Profiler and how Profiler creates a TRC or trace file, which is the same thing you're getting with SQL Trace. We pointed out the Windows System Monitor and its many names. Activity Monitor and what you can use that for. Transact SQL and how you can use that is very flexible for pulling information back. The Windows Logs, your default trace, talked about that. It's always on. It's your default trace, as the name implies. And then your dynamic management views, built-in system views that you can just query against to get information about the status of your SQL Server box. So, at the end of this video, my goal is that you should know how to perform ad hoc performance checks of a SQL Server database. And we've seen several tools that can do that. Create a baseline of your system performance, and any one of your trend analysis tools would be the ones you would use for creating that, and then to monitor that over time. Track those performance trends, like I said. Identify areas where changes are needed in order to increase your performance. So with that, that brings me to the end of monitoring SQL Server 2008 performance. Thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.